I'm going to introduce to you Helen Linden, who's written a lovely chapter for us about listening to children and how this links in with the rights of the child. So I'll hand over to you, Helen. Again, apologies for my lack of video for you, but I'm sending a great big hug to you across the airways.
Sending hugs in return, and it's lovely to be with you. No, I thought, and if it's all right with everybody that's with us today virtually, what I'd like to do is just give you a brief overview of the chapter and hopefully talk to you about my passion for this subject in particular. So when let me introduce myself first. Sorry, I was going to launch headlong into explaining myself, but let me introduce myself. So my name is Helen Linden. I am a former colleague of both Sarah and Zita. I used to work alongside them both at the University of Wolverhampton. I'm now actually the postgraduate programme lead at CREC. CREC is the Centre for Research in Early Childhood, and we're ordinarily based in central Birmingham, but unfortunately I'm ordinarily this year based in the end of my own living room because of the situation that we're all in with regards to COVID. And actually that's what makes this book very, very special and very, very needed at this time. I appreciate that we all wrote this before the onset of global pandemic, but actually in preparing for today and considering the material that I drew on in my chapter, I kept relating it back to everything that was going on at the moment in relation to COVID and found that really quite an interesting sort of second reflection for me. So what I'd like to do is just spend sort of 10 minutes or so really telling you a little bit about what I wrote and why I wrote it, and then certainly I'd welcome any questions from any of you really in the chat. It's interesting to see where you're all from and the different perspectives that you're bringing to the seminar today, which is fabulous. So this chapter actually comes as a result of, well, my entire educational career predominantly, my own positionality, if you like, around listening and around advocacy for children has been there for quite some time. It's something that I unpicked in quite a lot of detail in relation to my my own PhD, which is very, very close to completion, and this forms quite a thread through my PhD. The PhD really started as a result of the fact that I felt we should be doing more, particularly actually in early years, to listen to children more broadly. So in considering how we listen to children, I tried to take a bit of a rights-based angle with this issue, because obviously the two are very much intertwined. I thought first of all about the view of childhood and how we think about childhood, because I am a school teacher by trade and by profession, and I worked in primary predominantly. And after 10 years or so in primary education, I then moved into early years education and started working in the children's centres in Birmingham, and noticed quite a shift in how things were perceived. I noticed a shift in my own professional status, moving from being a primary school teacher to being a teacher in a children's centre. That seemed to warrant a little bit of a shift. In fact, I was asked by a parent about my demotion. And equally, the status of the children themselves and our view of those children and our view of how capable and competent those children are. So whereby I'd been very, very active in terms of school council and listening to children in quite a formulaic way in primary education, incorporating children's views into policy and practice in terms of a children's centre appeared to be more problematic to our broader sector. So I give some consideration at the start of the chapter about our view of childhood and where this has come from, and it draws on that new sociology of childhood, the sort of the Jenks and Prout sort of work around potentially our protectionist view and the fact that we do view children as particularly passive, and that we see our adult role in terms of that being about protection, and we must look after and protect these children. So I'll just trouble that a little bit at the start of the chapter. We then move on to consider definitions of listening. Invariably in academic life, there is no one succinct and straightforward definition of listening to children. There's a whole breadth of definitions that are alluded to, and the chapter actually just scrapes the surface. I have to say that there's quite an extensive list. Broadly speaking, though, there is agreement across the definitions that we need to listen to more than just spoken word. We need to listen, if we think of Malaguzzi's 100 languages of children, we need to listen to a whole range of ways that children communicate with us, and we need to listen to their voice in many different ways. And we also need to listen in an active way. So active listening and responding is very much part of that agreed definition, if you like, across the sector. We then move on to children's rights, and we look at this from of how it's developed through the UNCRC, in terms of maybe the nuances between actually a child's right to be heard and the adult's role in terms of taking children's views into account, and the potential really that there is for tension within the articles of the UNCRC around sort of best interests and right to be heard. So we sort of unpick the nuances around international definitions there, and then actually the chapter moves on to take quite a practical approach in terms of where listening sits in terms of our curriculum content. As you already are aware, and as I introduced myself at the beginning, I'm a teacher at heart, so I came at this very much with pedagogy and curriculum in mind when I started exploring how we listened to children, and actually my own reflections on sort of teaching within a national curriculum context is how much scope is there to listen to children within the national curriculum, how much choice is there for them, and how do we take their views on board in terms of their sort of educational trajectory, if you like. And I certainly reflect on the fact that within the early years curriculum, certainly at the moment, children's interests are very much at the centre of what we do, and we follow children's interests, and it's very much built around that unique child. And there is therefore a real tension between early years practice, particularly preschool early years practice, and then the experience that children have once they enter into the national curriculum and are on that trajectory, if you like, towards well, year 1 phonics, year 2 SATs, and so on and so forth, if those are even going to be with us this year. The next section of the chapter thinks about how we can do it. I've tried to make some elements of the chapter really speak to the practitioners out there, and really tried to make it useful. Both my MA research and my PhD research has looked at how we can actually do this, how we can actually listen to children, and I look at some of the suggestions really and tools that are out there to help us think about it. Two of them really that I was going to mention today briefly. One was the mosaic approach, Clark and Moss's mosaic approach, which looks at lots and lots of different ways that we can build up an overall picture of a child's view. We can listen to their parents, we can listen to their peers, we can engage the child in innovative ways within that early years practice in terms of trying to encourage their voice to come through, so we can get them to engage in map making of their setting, and we can get them to take us on a tour and see what they tell us about the setting as they do that. We can get them to engage in drawing, and we can talk to them while they're drawing, so that it's the process of the drawing that actually lets us know what they're thinking about their experience. We can engage in, they can create images, they can take photographs of things that are important and central to their educational experience, and we can use those in further discussions and as prompt for further discussions. So the mosaic approach presents us with lots and lots of different ways that we can actually ensure that we're building up an overall broad picture of the child. And the other tool, if you like, that I just wanted us to consider today was Hart's ladder of participation. And Hart's ladder is particularly interesting because it just provides us really with a way of thinking about how the levels of listening, if you like, and the impact of that listening. And it goes back to the definitions of listening that I mentioned right at the beginning of this, when I said that it's about being active and it's about there being a response. So it's all well and good listening, but what are you actually going to do about it afterwards? And what Heart's Ladder provides us with, and I'd encourage you to look up any visual really, you'll find plenty on Google. Look up Heart's Ladder and you'll see that there are some sections of the ladder that demonstrate how we can really listen in a deep and meaningful way and provide children with autonomy around the decisions that are being made. But I think most interestingly for those of us in education, it's got the other end of the ladder. And the other end of Heart's Ladder is around tokenistic listening. And it's around where we listen because it's a tick box and we just have to listen to the children, and yes, we've listened, but now this is what we're going to go on and do anyway. So I think for those of us working in education and for those of us considering sort of power dynamics within these systems, I think Heart's Ladder can be a really interesting tool to help us to just frame our thinking really. The chapter ends with considering the benefits and the challenges of trying to engage in essentially what is a very, very participatory approach. That's ultimately what the chapter's about, really fully involving children in a really participatory way in their own education. And it particularly considers the benefits in relation to their health and their well-being. In terms of really intrinsically motivating children and really encouraging them to drive their own learning, those are one of the key benefits really that I've experienced in terms of the research I've carried out in involving children very much in a participatory approach. The challenges are interesting in that it initially really each section of the chapter can provide elements of challenge in terms of how we define it, what we're thinking of listening, you know, the tension that exists within the children's rights rhetoric, the fact that our curriculum isn't necessarily predisposed to listen to the children and to be fully reflective, let's say, of their views, and so on and so forth. So the challenges really exist throughout the entire chapter, and I think actually we've got the challenges that have been presented to us at the moment in relation to, you know, like I said at the very, very beginning of this presentation, I've sat back and I've really reconsidered this chapter in relation to the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, and I find it particularly interesting, the rhetoric around children having to catch up curriculum with missed time from schools and things like that. And I wonder the extent to which we are rushing through guidelines, we are rushing through protocols, and I wonder how settings at the moment are able to actually listen to the children and involve them in a participatory manner in the continuation of their education through this particular situation. And I think to just sort of close, a reflection really from my own very, very personal context as a parent. I've experienced lockdown 1 and lockdown 2 because they spanned a couple of different academic years. I've had the joy of experiencing that with a year 6 child who was then transitioned into year 7, and I've seen her have a relative amount of autonomy over her education, and I've seen her provided with a whole suite menu of possibilities that she can explore and engage in, and that's really piqued her curiosity, and she's been very much involved and has been able to make choices and therefore motivated, and her well-being has followed suit. And equally, I've seen her have to engage in rather a prescribed educational timetable, whereby she hasn't been able to be involved at all actually in her education, and her participation in her own education has diminished markedly as much of it has been carried out in an online forum, much as we are today, sadly. And I've also seen a decline in her emotional health and well-being as a result. And that is just a sort of a final and personal reflection on the end, really. But as I'm hoping you can tell, listening and advocating for the rights of children is something that I'm particularly passionate about. And it's been really interesting for me, actually, in light of this, to revisit the chapter over the last few days. So yes, year 7, Sarah, I know. I don't know how it happened either. And I would very, very much welcome any questions or comments at the end of that little presentation.
Thank you, Helen. So if anybody would like to ask questions directly or add them to the chat, that would be great.
I have to say, Zita, it's been very, very interesting reconsidering all of the sections of the book in light of, I mean, I'm not sure whether that's, I'm afraid I wasn't able to join this morning, but certainly it's, you know, timely is absolutely where we're at, isn't it?
Sarah and I said that, you know, 5 years ago when we thought about doing this book, and when we started to ask who would like to join us to do it, who would have known what was to come, and you know, how timely this book would be. Really, it was such an important book to do anyway, but even more so now, isn't it? And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to organise this seminar as soon as possible, to get the content out as much as possible, to be considered in the context that in what we're dealing with right now, as well as generally in practice. Let me just see if there's any questions. Helen, just before we move on to the next presentation, I don't know, I am so sorry because I've had real technical issues. I'm actually, I think, now in as a guest. Back in now, it booted me out again out of Teams. It's the second time today that that's happened. But did you explain a little bit about some of the listening techniques that you've used in your own research? Could you just
yes, yeah, I did. I mean, I touched on it briefly in terms of thinking about how we listen to children. I certainly talked about the mosaic approach there. I think what I could certainly reflect on, my PhD research kind of was influenced, if you like, a little by mosaic, but then I went off to really kind of delve into things to see what I could do with them, sort of myself and separately. I particularly found drawing incredibly helpful and useful, and I briefly mentioned it earlier, but in particular I found really concentrating on the process of the drawing. I found that children you'd be distracted almost by the object, the third space, if you like, in the room. So it wouldn't be that you were having a direct discussion and the child wouldn't feel on the spot to have to find you an answer, but to be able to have the drawing there and to just talk the children around the drawing. So whether it was something like preferences, or one of the drawing activities that I used was a graduated, so we used concentric circles where they put an item of sort of greatest preference, if they like, favourite, right in the middle, and the responses were graduated out from that. And actually even the youngest children in the research really understood the nuances of this graduated approach, which was really helpful. But equally, so it produced like an outcome. There was an end product from it that could be read, if you like, as data, but equally the process of engaging the children in that drawing just enabled them that space and time to have the conversations. And I think in terms of considering children's well-being, the time and space to listen time and again comes up as one of those really, really centrally important things. And actually, in terms of the challenges of being able to do it, and certainly the challenges that are around at the moment, how on earth do we provide and protect that time and space for all of the children? Makes it very, very difficult.
That's thank you, Helen. Is there any other questions? Oh, we have got a question in the chat. Was that particular exercise done with small groups of children or whole classrooms?
It was done actually with smaller groups, but what was interesting about the activity is that the children very quickly caught on and continued it without adult direction, as is often the case in early years environments. So it started off as a relatively small group activity with 5 children, I believe, and it just sort of snowballed, because obviously all of the concentric circles were pre-made and ready, drawn and done for the children, so that they didn't have to worry about that element of it, although they could have done, but it enabled them to just carry on and use them for other purposes as well, and use them for themselves, which did happen.
That's great. Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you for being involved today. We might have more questions at the end, if that's okay, of our presentation.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you for the next at least 45-50 minutes, if I can possibly stay on.
And if anybody has any extra questions for Helen, please do add them to the chat. And Helen, if you could keep an eye on the chat, that would be great. Thank you.
No problem at all. And I've popped my email address and my Twitter handle. So, you know, if anybody thinks of a question tomorrow, then do get back in touch.
Thanks so much, Helen. Thank you. So we're going to move on to my presentation with Michael Joplin and Andy Aston on what resilience means to children. Michael, would you mind trying to add that presentation, please?
I'm just going to do the beginning bit of this and then hand over to Andy and Zita. So what we're talking about is our chapter on what does resilience mean to children. Can we move on to the next slide? So what the chapter, we're not going to cover all of this today, but what the chapter looks at is some of the areas we're talking about already this morning. So considering the definitions of resilience and the complexity involved in defining resilience. There's some discussion around the theory about whether children are born with traits that help them to be resilient, and then the influences are the kind of genetic against environment issue, and then some examples of childhood resilience in both major and minor circumstances of adversity. So what moving on to the next one, this is based on a project that we've been doing. It's kind of come to an end, depending how you define end, really. So called Head Start in Wolverhampton, which was a big lottery funded program, 6 locations in England. We evaluated the Wolverhampton program, it's a program which is based on improving resilience, well-being, mental health in, broadly speaking, 10 to 16-year-olds. There was a range of activities in schools and in community organisations. Some of the examples there's all kinds of things going on. There was a certain amount of freedom involved in that. And picking up again on some of the things that were being talked about this morning, there's various elements in terms of the evaluation, it was a 3-year evaluation. It's kind of the research component finished as lockdown started, really, as things turned out. There's a quantitative measuring element so we used the child and youth resilience measure that I put in the chat earlier, which is Ungar and colleagues, along other measures. So we did do some measuring of resilience, and that measurement, which we did over kind of 3 years, showed all kinds of things. It showed that children and young people that were involved in the research were more resilient than the average, the norm for the measure, but also that resilience kind of declines as they move out of primary and into secondary school. Also that girls in primary school are more resilient than boys in our sample, but that kind of swaps around as they move into secondary school, all kind of other issues around that. But the main thing we're talking about is some of the more qualitative research that was involved, and that's Andy's going to start taking you through that.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll just put these down here. What basically happened is we went into schools and community centres within the Wolverhampton area. We gathered all together, I think it was 76 responses from these children. Obviously, what the idea was is to not just look at whether the children are actually resilient, it's obviously where they can build that resilience from, what support they get, how it is obviously offered to them. There are numerous activities what Head Start actually have done with these children, from Kung Fu classes and obviously arts, music and stuff like that. But this particular one, what we did was we did something the one project was called What's Good, What's Bad, which I'll move on to in a little bit. So obviously we're looking at the people who are attending, whether they have positive perceptions of themselves. Do these children believe they're actually resilient? And what support is available for those children? Like I say, some of these were at school and some of the things were also in the community settings as well. So examples of resilience, we asked children to provide us with certain examples. However, in this scenario, only 17% of the children were happy to do that. Obviously, some of the quotations below will give a little bit of those examples. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm sure you can have a look there. What we do find, though, is obviously some children are already going through traumatic experiences in their life. There you go, a boyfriend passing away. We haven't got the back history of these children, so obviously these were just the quotes which they give us on that day.
Sorry, Andy. So sorry to interrupt. Just to say, it was 17% of the 76 children that did provide examples of resilience that chose to identify these significant examples of adversity. So we asked all 76, they all gave us examples back, but 17% gave us these more significant adversity examples. Apologies.
No, do apologise. Okay, thank you very much for that, Zita. So everyday adversity and resilience in childhood, despite the negative perspectives, obviously 50% of children who provided examples of the resilience identified everyday examples of adversity from school or school-related activities. Again, there's another couple down here. But one of the ones I would like to bring your attention to, there was a young gentleman who said to me, I asked him why he was interested in learning about knife crime. And he said, well, my brother was stabbed by somebody and that young gentleman is now in prison, but he's due to come out of prison very shortly. And we're worried that he will obviously come back and attack the family. So obviously that in itself is, obviously a traumatic thing where resilience, I wouldn't know how you would try and overcome that kind of thing. And there's other examples. Someone was being rude to my friends, so I was standing up for them. Even though I wasn't fighting, I just didn't give up. I wanted to help my best friend. And then finally, some more home-related examples. Obviously, the considerations might be minor, showing different experiences of adversity. When I was 6, I wanted to ride my bike. I kept trying. Obviously, there's an example there of maybe where it's probably a strict father or something like that, obviously trying to encourage the child, not strict, but obviously trying to encourage that child to do better with the language. Looking after siblings, and then just the usual do not give up kind of words in regards to resilience as well. Trying to get in dance company. Yeah. There's another young gentleman as well, finally, before I pass on to Zita, who said to me, I'm currently hearing this word resilience. I never used to know what it was. However, now I'm worried that I am not resilient when it wasn't an issue to me before. That's obviously something we need to consider as well. So I'll hand you over to Zita.
Thank you, Andy. So just to talk about some of the key findings from this year's phase of data collection. So as Michael was saying, we carried out this data collection for 3 years in total. So in this year we had 77 children in total that completed this card sort and 76 that provided examples of resilience. Almost half of the 77 children who completed the card sort agreed that they were resilient people. What was interesting from the examples they provided, though, that they mostly shared a similar understanding of resilience, but this tended to circulate more around success through perseverance rather than endurance through mental toughness. Children also focused more on everyday, possibly what we would consider to be minor experiences of adversity, in contrast to what is predominantly in literature about around definitions of resilience that focus more on major experiences of adversity. Across the 3 years of data collection, the majority of children had negative perspectives of their schooling experiences. However, as we discussed, half chose to identify examples of their resilience from school or school-related experiences. Can I go on to the next page, please, Andy? Thank you. Our chapter evidences individualised circumstances children face at home, school and in their community. We found in this research that children can be resilient in everyday and significant experiences of adversity. The examples provided in this presentation, we believe, should be considered as examples of resilience because they have, the children have evidence that they've persevered and or bounced back in the face of adversity. What we found also interesting was that children express that they benefited from moments of resilience, whether that be significant or everyday, that they benefited from them being identified and celebrated with them. But because their definition of how they define resilience was different to what we may necessarily define resilience to be, it was interesting because they may not necessarily, those moments that the children decided to talk about may not necessarily be picked up as much by us. So one of the things that we found from this was it's those everyday experiences that children consider that make them resilient people, and that those moments should also be identified and celebrated with them when they've bounced back from something, when they've tried again, when they've persevered, and yes, so that they can have those conversations with the people that are working with them. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Andy? So some references for everybody if you'd like them. And then there is a last page, isn't there, Andy? That
on this actual one, I do apologise. So I don't know where that is. I haven't got that one, Zeta. Sorry.
Do you want to just talk about it quickly, Andy, before we close?
Yeah. Can you what, sorry?
Do you want to just talk about it quickly before we close rather than show it? And I'll see if I can get it up on the screen. Yeah,
I do apologise for that, ladies and gents. So on the last screen, what we did, it was a project called What's Good, What's Bad, and we did that in a community setting. There was 12 young people aged from 9 to 12, and we got them to, what we wanted to do was give them a project. What they wanted to do was what they wanted to research about. So we were just pretty much bystanders, and the children basically created their own questionnaires on what they were interested in. So it was things like litter, knife crime, graffiti in the area, things like that. And what we actually did, we got them to do a questionnaire, and we escorted them politely to the local shops, so they could actually go into the shops. These would just be like local off licenses, Tesco's and things like that. The mini shops, Greg's, things like that. They would ask some of the staff, obviously, when it was quieter, they would ask the staff what their perceptions were around the area, how they could help to reduce crime and things like that. And we obviously got that feedback, and believe it or not, some of the children actually sent an email to the local MP, who responded in kind, obviously highlighting the effects, what the children's positivity had. And some of these children are from poor backgrounds, that may have even been excluded from school, and this was done during the summer holidays. So to get these type of children to engage in research and actually think they may want to become researchers in future, we obviously think was obviously a phenomenal thing to do.
Thank you, Andy. We have some questions. We have one that says, sorry if I missed this as I was still making notes on Helen's presentation, but how old were the children? Also, how was the question asked in a way where you did not predetermine what being resilient or experiencing adverse experience meant? So the children were aged from 9 to 17. So we went in both primary and secondary schools for most of the years of data collection, and as Andy said, into community settings as well. And all we did was with the card sort, we gave them a sheet of paper as well with a couple of questions, because the card sort it's like a bit like a reverse pyramid. So we were asking them to decide if they agreed or disagreed with these particular statements, and the ones that were put in the most extreme columns of the distribution grid, we asked them to just explain why they placed those statements there. So they wrote down a sentence or two on that on their report sheets, and we gave assistance obviously if they asked us to do so. But the last question on that was just, please give us an example of when you think you've been resilient. Something like that was the question. So there was no sort of, it literally was, please provide us with an example. And only one chose not to write an example at all. And all of the others, as we said, the 76 that Andy talked about, all gave examples of resilience. So it really, we didn't predetermine anything. We just asked them for an example. And those were the examples they provided. Then there's another question. Is the adversities in this study significant threats to the persons? How do one make a distinction between when it's resilience to significant threats or normal coping to milder difficult everyday situations? Michael, do you want to come in on that one, or? Oh, you're muted, Michael, sorry.
It was off. They mute themselves, these microphones. I think the sooner we get rid of Microsoft Teams, the better, actually. It just doesn't work, does it? Anyway, that's a separate issue. In terms of, I suppose we had different strands to this research project. So on one hand, we used the CYIM measure in schools to measure kind of resilience and acknowledging all of the problems there are with that, because that's a very general way of measuring resilience. So that's how we looked at resilience to measure change over the period of the project. But the qualitative work, which involved the Q work that Zita and Andy have just been talking about, and we made a film. We got a film company in to make a film, which is available as well with young people, where they decided what they wanted to film, and they made the film, and they learned how to edit film and that kind of thing. Then they talked about all kinds of experiences they'd have, and that ranged from, relatively low-level stuff of, failing an exam or not being able to get into a football team or something, through to being bullied or seeing people shot on the street and that kind of thing. And there we try to respond, kind of appropriately and get them, if they needed support, they got some support for that. But we weren't making any judgments. It was about what they thought were experiences they'd gone through. So the qualitative work was very much based on what they wanted to talk about, whereas the qualitative work was about that, whereas the quantitative work was much broader. So we got the kind of, our broad survey was of something like 3,000 children over 3 years, whereas obviously the qualitative work is kind of much smaller samples. So I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. I think if there is any more questions for us, if we could add them to the chat, and we'll keep an eye out and respond to them if that's okay. And we'll move on to the last presentation for this time slot. Somebody's just commented and asked if our book is going to be available online through the university. I assume you're talking about University of Wolverhampton, and I think that there will be some available through the Learning Centre, yes. If that's not the case and you're talking about a different university, please do comment in the chat. That would be great. Thank you. So the final presentation is from Michael Joplin again, and you're ending the session by focusing on benefits and tensions in education and social work when working collaboratively.
You just have to listen to me. Sorry. Right. This is a kind of chapter that I wrote with Sharon Vincent, who's also from Northumbria University, who's also here today. If you've got any particular questions, difficult questions, I'll get her to answer them. And what we were based on two research projects that we've done that were kind of aimed at supporting and improving provision for vulnerable families. So, and what we're kind of looking at in the chapter is how education and social work, particularly as two kind of areas that support vulnerable families, work together. And the kind of, as the chapter title says, the benefits and tensions involved in that. So the kind of, I've just got 4 slides that may appear at some point. The starting point for that, and it's interesting, the first one is kind of the word vulnerability. Was vulnerable has been kind of one of those buzzwords in kind of social policy and education policy in the last few years. It's interesting that this morning it came up as a kind of negative and a deficit term. I'm not sure it always is. It always has been, and maybe we can try and reclaim it as a more positive term, because it doesn't have to be negative. But certainly vulnerability is kind of part of a zeitgeist that Catherine Eccleston, who's one of the other authors in the book, has identified and talked about. So vulnerability is kind of there, and it's something that people funding research want to fund. So that's kind of our starting point. We had a fairly neutral approach, I think, in terms of using it, not using it with any kind of connotations. There's also the fact that vulnerability kind of brings together resilience and well-being in positive and negative ways. The fact that it gets used more and more frequently, you hear it used quite a lot in the lockdown at the moment, kind of vulnerable children, vulnerable groups having to be supported. It shows that how often it's used, and also that it's often kind of neutralized by used as a term because you hear it so often. And like certain elements of resilience that we've talked about already, like other kind of areas in kind of policy, it gets polarized. So on one hand, we talk about kind of vulnerability gets used as a deficit term in terms of blaming individuals. More kind of socially enlightened or social democratic views of it will tend to see it as a kind of explanation and being part of kind of environmental factors that lead to vulnerability. And as I said, so it looks like the slides aren't going to upload, so I'm just going to talk. So I'm sorry about that.
Sorry, Michael, we've tried, but they won't upload. So sorry.
Yeah, it's today. It's Teams. Teams is rubbish. So anyway, I will just talk, and hopefully this will make sense anyway. So there's the underpinning research research into two programs, both of them based in the northwest of England, which were aimed at improving the well-being of vulnerable families. The first one was a large kind of citywide project which aimed to bring together all the support for vulnerable children, young people and families in a single program. And the second project, slightly further north in the northwest, was in a small part of one town working with 10 families. So the scale was completely different. Obviously, the scale of the research involved was slightly different. But again, broadly speaking, there were mixed methods projects involving looking at data, looking at troubled families data and other data with all of the issues associated with the use of the word troubled. And we also did quite a lot of interviews with families and with practitioners in schools, in social work, and in other areas, and to produce case studies, and quite detailed case studies. So there's a kind of combination there. In the chapter, we kind of use Smith's framework for collaborative and multidisciplinary working as a way of looking at the benefits and the kind of issues involved. The first one that in that framework is about establishing a sense of purpose. So what we found is that is it showing now? No. Oh, there it is. We're about towards about the third slide now. If we can move through. Shame you didn't get to see the picture as well, which is one I really like that picture. From the days when children were allowed to walk around with cardboard boxes on their heads. So in terms of establishing a sense of purpose, both programs were adopting kind of holistic approach, but you know, trying to offer the right kind of support to meet the needs, particular needs of children, young people and families. The attempting to be holistic was obviously dependent on the size of the program. So the city-wide program came up against all kind of issues in that because it was trying to bring so much complexity together. The smaller program was much better in terms of that, in working with families and working to get a kind of common sense of purpose to improve the way they were able to access services and improve their lives. The second element is mediation. That the kind of these programs are quite successful in mediating between different interests. So often that's a really simple. They obviously kind of focus on doing things quite simply, in that you know, it was about working, you know, somebody in, for example, kind of a family support service, there was somebody there who would negotiate and mediate between schools and between social workers or between social services. That started to break down some of the barriers, so that kind of blaming that you sometimes get didn't go on. So you wouldn't say, well, actually that's education's problem, or that's social work's problem, or there the kind of education psychologist needs to come in. So there was an important mediation role. The third element to emphasize is about acknowledging conflict and complexity. It's not easy for these programs, particularly to come together and actually try and improve what is a kind of complex issue. They have very much had a neutral way of looking at issues, and it kept, you know, families kept saying, well, they had a non-judgmental approach, although they had both a kind of insider and outsider with families, but also having a kind of objective view. And that often the families who need a lot of support or experience a lot of support from social services or from kind of schools don't get that. They feel judged and they feel uncomfortable meeting with professionals. So the programs, particularly the smaller program, took that as a starting point and were able to deal with that because they weren't trying to trying to work around it. They were working kind of with the grain of the complexity of it all. And then finally, to different degrees, they were able to develop mutual trust and respect. So there was it was about being consistent and communicating well. The simplest, you know, again, fairly simple things, but one of the people we interviewed said, well, if they say something's going to happen, it does happen. It's about the kind of, you know, under promising and under delivering, which again doesn't happen as much as you might want it to. Particularly the smaller of the two programs had very much an emphasis on co-production, working with families. You can do that much more easily if you're working with 10 families as opposed to working with all families across a city. So what would be the last slide, if you could see it, or maybe you can. Implications of all this, which is what we kind of end the chapter with. 3 points here. Supporting families and children's well-being and promoting their resilience is a complex thing. It needs agencies such as education, schools, early years, social work to work together and to mediate between services, and that building relationship and trust works at different levels. So it's professionals building relationship and trust, but also with families and between families and professionals. One thing that we emphasize, which kind of picks up on what Helen was talking about earlier, is that this kind of effective or multi-agency collaboration generally still rarely involves families, and particularly rarely involves young people very much as partners, despite all the talk about being co-producing or co-configuring. Young people don't get heard, and they don't, which again has negative effects on their well-being and their resilience. And then the final point really is the deficit perceptions that are around of vulnerable families still has a negative effect on their well-being and resilience. So being labelled as troubled or vulnerable, or all of the kind of rhetoric around the troubled families from about 5-6 years ago has a negative view, and we need the support system needs to be reconfigured as well to overcome. So the questions I was going to leave you with, if the slides haven't frozen, were how can we do this? How can we facilitate a kind of better collaboration between agencies and families? How do we listen better? How do we set systems up to listen better to young people, particularly, but also families? And then how do we overcome some of these perceptions around vulnerability being a deficit thing and a negative thing? So I will stop there, and I'm sorry there were no slides. There are slides. Who knows why they don't work?
Thank you, Michael. Do you want to open the floor then for questions on the questions you've ended with? Is that what you'd like to do initially, or?
I don't mind really. I just, they probably won't work anyway.
Does anybody have any comment on those questions at the end?
I could start off on that bit of a reply to the question. I mean, children's centres were a great initiative, weren't they? And then in recent years, there's been, you know, all the problems of underfunding in terms of this sort of non-stigmatising approach and bringing together different professional groups and so on. But they've had I mean, one area where they haven't really provided much, I don't think, is in terms of work with more with kind of families and parents, as opposed to just focusing on children, you know, just with kind of almost like playgroup activities sometimes. Not that I would want to disparage that, but you know what I mean, you know, not sort of going out to perhaps things like family or parent counselling or whatever. But I don't know, I haven't kept up with what's happening over children's centres at the moment. I don't know if anybody else knows anything more about that.
There aren't very many left.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, that sort of setting seems a good start. Yeah.
Well, I think, yes, they were early victim of austerity largely. I think that's the problem. And there were really positive associations with children's centres bringing people together. But some of, particularly one of, you know, the larger project here, we did get into that kind of area because there still were some children's centres, and that helps. But that only goes, you know, children's centres only applying when children are a certain age. Once they get older and into school, then that doesn't help particularly. And that level of interagency working and collaboration is really patchy and quite hard to do. But yeah, the children's centres, strange that they were reduced, really.
Thank you, Lydia. Sarah, have you got a question too?
I was just going to sort of extend from Lydia's discussion around children's centres and to say that where we are in the Central Midlands, the majority of the children's centres have been incorporated into the early help agenda, which means that they're covering the 0 to 19 age range rather than specifically the early years now. So where they do still exist, because a lot have been closed down, despite the law that says they can't be until the parents have been consulted. They are still operational, but they tend to be more for early intervention and preventative work for safeguarding, rather than early intervention and preventative work for play, as we would have done through learning. So, sadly.
Thanks, Sarah. Helen's also put children's centres, they've vanished largely, but I believe we will eventually come full circle and see them return, but probably under a different name.